The sprawling expanse of the Galactic Empire was a testament to the delicate balance that had endured for millennia. Within its star-spangled territories, a tapestry of species, each wildly different in form, thought, and ambition, worked in unison under a single unshaken principle: peace at any cost. For over 4,000 years, this ideal had held firm, weathering political turbulence, fleeting conflicts, and moments of misunderstanding. To the inhabitants of the Empire, peace was not simply an absence of war. It was a very fabric of existence. At the heart of this vast coalition stood humanity. A latecomer to the Empire's history, Earth's admission as a member planet 3 centuries ago was initially met with skepticism by the elder races. The Dravani, master archivists of the Empire, questioned humanity's brief and turbulent history. The mighty Carnid clans, whose fleets patrolled entire sectors, doubted the capabilities of such a fledgling race. And yet, humanity thrived. Their audacious curiosity and adaptive ingenuity made them valuable contributors in technology, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Among humanity's representatives, 2 figures embodied their species' ascent in the galactic order. Ambassador Cale Arden had spent years honing his skills in delicate negotiations, bringing even the most fractious disputes within the Empire to quiet resolution. Tall and sharp-eyed, Cale was a man of conviction, revered by his colleagues for his unyielding faith in diplomacy. Opposite him was Commander Lyra Rhine, leader of humanity's fleet in the Andron Quadrant. Charismatic and daring, Lyra was a veteran of countless spacefaring rescue missions, though her reliance on pragmatism sometimes clashed with Cale's idealism. Together, they stood as symbols of humanity's potential. One a diplomat, the other a warrior, united in service of peace. And yet, peace is a fragile construct, one easily disrupted by the unseen gears of ambition and miscalculation. The Empire had not been without its challenges. Though outwardly unified, cracks had long been growing beneath its seemingly impenetrable surface. Minor factions whispered discontent in the dark. Resource imbalances across quadrants brewed jealousy and quiet defiance. The Quellan Accord, a long-contentious treaty that distributed planetary terraforming rights, had recently sparked protests among several member species. For now, the Galactic Senate maintained control, but many feared the old alliances were fraying. For Cale and Lyra, the signs were growing unmistakable. At a summit aboard the Concordia, the Empire's flagship, they were briefed on a skirmish near the Renal Expanse. A human colony transport had vanished, and neighboring Vorathian vessels had been spotted leaving the region. The Vorathians, known for their imposing exoskeletal forms and territorial pride, were quick to dismiss blame. But whispers of confrontation rippled through the Senate chambers. This was no isolated incident, but the latest in a series of small provocations. "We can't assume it's an attack," Cale had argued as the Council's holographic display highlighted the disappearance. "A shared investigation would strengthen ties instead of breaking them." Lyra frowned, her gloved hands gripping the edge of the briefing table. "Diplomacy won't return those missing ships, Cale. We've already sent envoys, and what did that get us? Ambiguity and stone walls. And war will bring us answers." Cale shot back. "You think this empire, built on the backs of thousands of years of trust, will endure another great conflict?" The tension between them crackled, reflecting a broader unease spreading across the empire. Though the two held mutual respect, their philosophies were on the verge of collision. Cale believed in communication, Lyra in the necessity of action. For now, the Senate ruled in Cale's favor, agreeing to dispatch a neutral envoy to the Vorathians for further clarification. Yet doubt lingered in the air. Outside the conference, the Empire's upper councilors buzzed with growing unease. Each species had its own interpretation of the events, a prelude to something larger, or an isolated misstep. The Rilhan clan spoke of omens, their translucent forms shimmering with distress. The ancient Jevra philosophers muttered warnings of cycles repeating. It seemed that the specter of conflict, dormant for so long, loomed closer with every passing day. Even as Kale worked to dispel the brewing tension, Lyra met with the fleet's high command in secret. "A chain is only as strong as its weakest link," she murmured, pointing at intelligence readouts of the Renal sector. "If the Vorathians think we'll let them chip away at us without consequence, we're finished. Diplomatic channels aren't what's keeping this peace alive. It's knowing the consequences of breaking it. For decades, humanity had been proof that diplomacy could triumph over chaos. But a shift was coming, like the subtle drift of solar winds before a storm. The disappearance of the transport was the kindling. All it needed was a spark. And unbeknownst to Kale or Lyra, it would soon come in the form of a single intercepted message, buried deep in encrypted data logs. It revealed that a Vorathian patrol had fired on the transport under direct orders. The truth would shatter not only the fragile trust between species, but the very foundations of peace itself. As Kale prepared to leave for a new round of negotiations, his assistant handed him the decrypted file. It arrived in a data capsule, stamped with the crest of the Imperial Security Division. He stared at the lines of cold, damning text, disbelief giving way to fury. In the stillness of his chambers, Kale pressed his forehead to the viewport, gazing at the stars that once promised unity. Somewhere in that vast expanse, his people were in danger. His heart ached at the choices before him. The stars offered no answers. The air in the Galactic Senate Hall was thick with tension as Ambassador Kale Arden strode to the podium. Thousands of delegates from the Empire's member species filled the chamber, their holographic projections flickering like restless phantoms. Debate over the human transport's disappearance had dominated every corner of the Empire for weeks, but the newly revealed evidence had thrown an accelerant onto the embers of dissent. "Honored delegates," Kale began, his voice steady despite the pressure. "The data retrieved by Imperial Security is irrefutable. The Vorathian fleet, under orders from Commander Sindril of the Renal Defense Network, opened fire on an unarmed civilian vessel, one flying the insignia of this empire. Hundreds of lives were lost." He paused, scanning the assembly. The faces staring back at him were a cacophony of emotions: disbelief, outrage, fear. If this empire cannot hold accountable those who trample its principles, then what does this council even stand for? The hall erupted into a storm of voices. The carnage bellowed calls for retribution. The soft-spoken Luriel delegates murmured appeals for calm. Kale remained at the podium, his measured gaze unwavering. He knew this was a moment of reckoning not just for humanity, but for the Empire itself. Across the galaxy, citizens watched the proceedings unfold, their confidence in peace eroding by the second. Commander Lyra Rhine watched the broadcast from the bridge of her flagship, Sentinel. Despite the outward calm she maintained before her crew, she couldn't suppress the gnawing urgency rising within her. The confirmation of Vorathian culpability had removed any remaining doubt. "Kale is playing a dangerous game," she muttered, almost to herself. Her lieutenant, Ral Ven, a seasoned officer with flecks of silver in his hair, regarded her with caution. "The ambassador speaks for Earth," he said. "His caution is what's kept us from war before." Lyra shook her head. "His caution will lead us to ruin this time. Sindril won't be the only one testing the Empire's resolve. If we falter here, if we let this go unanswered, others will follow." Lyra's disdain for inaction was not born of impulsiveness, but of harsh experience. She had seen firsthand the cost of hesitation in her earlier years. Friends lost to indecision, missions failing for lack of swift action. Yet, as much as she bristled against Kale's patience, she understood its place. But this time, she believed he was wrong. Back in the Senate Hall, Kale's address had only hardened the divide among delegates. The Vorathian representative, a tall figure encased in segmented, obsidian-colored armor, stepped forward. Sindril's second counselor, Vorzak Drak, was known for his fiery temperament, and he wasted no time asserting his defense. "These accusations are outrageous," Vorzak growled, his voice metallic and resonant. "The Renal Expanse is a volatile border region. Your ships encroach on Vorathian territory as scavengers in the dark. Commander Sindril was defending our people from an unmarked intruder. Kale clenched his jaw but maintained his composure. The records show otherwise. The transport broadcast its identity codes on all known frequencies. Commander Sindril's actions were a preemptive strike, not defense. Vorzak advanced, his armored form towering over the smaller holographic projection of Kale. Your words are nothing but smoke and mirrors. If war is what you seek, humanity will find itself torn apart like a child among wolves. The Council's mediator intervened, calling for silence, but the damage was done. The battle lines were becoming clearer. Behind the scenes, Lyra received the directive she had anticipated but dreaded. Humanity's fleet was being placed on high alert. Word had reached her that Vorathian fleets were amassing near Renal, bolstering defenses. Diplomacy was faltering, and humanity had no intention of sitting idle. Kale, meanwhile, retreated to his quarters, where exhaustion and doubt pressed heavily on him. The chamber lights were dim, the only illumination coming from a single holographic projection, Earth. The planet spun slowly, its vibrant blues and greens seemingly untouched by the strife, gripping the stars above it. A knock broke the silence. It was Lyra, flanked by her assistant Ralven. "We need to talk," she said, crossing her arms. Her tone was firm but not unkind. Kale gestured for her to enter. Negotiations are hanging by a thread. Kale began without preamble. "I'm not ready to abandon them." "They won't hold, Kale," Lyra replied. "Vorathian ships are moving. We're already seeing border skirmishes near the Garland outposts. It's a matter of time before they strike openly. We're reacting when we need to act." Kale stood and turned to face her. And what would that look like? Humanity striking the first blow against another species in defiance of the very peace we've championed? Do you think the Empire will stand with us? Do you think they'll protect us if we don't? Lyra countered, her voice rising. "You said it yourself, Kale. Hundreds are dead. How many more will it take before we call this what it is? A war." The room grew heavy with the unspoken truth between them. The tension broke when Kale finally spoke. "If this goes wrong, Lyra, we'll lose everything we've built here. Diplomacy takes time. Patience isn't weakness. Neither is preparing for what we already know is coming," Lyra said, her tone softening. She placed a hand on his arm. "You're trying to save peace, Kale. But sometimes the cost of peace is fighting for it." The conversation left Kale more unsettled than he cared to admit. He watched as Lyra left, her confident stride embodying the resolve he struggled to summon. Lyra's words gnawed at him, but he clung to the belief that the situation could still be salvaged. He turned back to the hologram of Earth, silently praying that his efforts would not end in ashes. Far away, on the cold expanse of the Vorathian command vessel, Sindril gazed at tactical reports with the stoicism of a veteran leader. "The humans are testing the Empire's leash," she murmured to her second. "Let's see how far they'll let it stretch before it snaps." The silence before the first strike was a torment unto itself. The human fleet lay poised at the Renal boundary, a vanguard of unity amidst growing uncertainty. Commander Lyra Rhine stood on the command deck of the Sentinel, the vast expanse of stars sprawling across the reinforced viewport before her. She had never seen them so still, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. "All systems primed, Commander," reported Ralven, his expression betraying none of the anxiety he surely felt. "Fleet positions confirmed. Orders." Lyra hesitated, her resolve trembling under the weight of what she was about to unleash. Across the channel, ships held thousands of lives that looked to her for guidance. One command, and their future would pivot from peace to war. "Hold formation," she ordered, her voice like steel. "We'll respond if, and only if, they make the first move." Kale Ardent, seated in a civilian observatory on board the diplomatic vessel Aegis, watched the same scene unfold with mounting despair. Through a private link to Lyra's command deck, he implored her, "You're gambling with lives, Lyra. These provocations could still be contained. Her jaw tightened at the sound of his voice. That's why we're waiting. But if the Vorathians think we won't act decisively, it'll embolden them and any other faction watching the standoff. Even you can see that. I see that every diplomatic failure means another step toward disaster. The channel went silent between them. For all their differences, the two shared an acute understanding that time was rapidly running out. Each moment of inaction carried the crushing weight of decision deferred. Across the sector, Vorathian forces were not idle. Commander Sindril, her command nest bristling with holographic displays, tracked the positioning of humanity's ships. "They're testing us, Vorzak," she said to her second counselor, who stood behind her like a shadow. "They are children stumbling into a battlefield," Vorzak growled. "Let's show them what a cornered Vorathian can do." Sindril's mandibles twitched in restrained agreement. "Not yet. Push them, but hold the line. Make them break first. Let them prove to the Empire it is they who seek war." The orders set in motion a tense series of maneuvers, Vorathian ships advancing subtly closer to human vessels, proximity alarms humming softly aboard the Sentinel. The aggression was calculated, a masterwork of baiting. Ral leaned toward Lyra. "Commander, we're about to cross tolerable proximity thresholds. If they push any closer, they'll cross a line," she finished, staring intently at the enemy formation. "We're not here to be bullied. Bring our forward shields online and weapons to standby. Let them see we're prepared." On board the Aegis, Kale caught the same readings. "Lyra," he warned through the channel, "stand down. If this escalates any further—" "It's already escalated," Lyra barked. She immediately reined in her temper, voice lowering with regret. "Kale, look at the logs. They've made their intentions clear. And if we fire first," he shot back, "what will that make us?" The question hung heavily unanswered. Then the bridge erupted into sound. Alarms blaring as a Vorathian cruiser discharged a barrage of fire that raked along the shields of the human ship Vanguard. Gasps filled the comm channels. "Damage report," Lyra ordered sharply. "Shields holding, no critical damage," Rao responded. "They fired the first shot." Lyra's tone was grim as she turned to her fleet officer. "Issue the command. Defensive retaliation only. Target their lead ship's engines. Disable them if possible." The message rippled across the fleet, and human vessels surged forward in formation. Streams of light from plasma and railfire danced across the void. The battlefield lit up with the bright agony of conflict. The first real war to scar the galaxy in 4,000 years. Kale sat stunned in his chamber as the first transmissions of combat relayed back. Faces flickered across monitors. Soldiers barking commands. Terrified pilots scrambling to recover from missile strikes. Casualties mounting on both sides. He felt as if an invisible chasm had opened, swallowing the ideals he'd worked his entire career to preserve. On the command deck of the Sentinel, Lyra navigated the chaos with practiced precision, her voice steady amid the calls and cries of her crew. "Adjust formations. Protect the Vanguard at all costs. If we push too far, we risk full collapse." Sindril, observing the battle's progression, allowed herself a sliver of satisfaction. "So it begins," she muttered as her ships engaged in deadly synchronization. They'll be easy prey. But she had underestimated her opponent's resolve. Lyra's fleet, prepared for such an engagement, struck with precision and tactical clarity. One by one, Vorathian ships faltered under the combined might of human ingenuity and military discipline. Yet, Lyra knew better than to celebrate too early. "This isn't victory," she murmured to Ral after one successful assault disabled a Vorathian cruiser. "It's survival." For hours, the battle raged on, forcing both sides to taste the bitter cost of war. Across the Empire, word of the conflict spread like wildfire. The Galactic Senate was thrown into chaos, factions forming instantly, some denouncing humanity as aggressors, others rallying to their defense. Civil unrest began bubbling in planets far from the battlefield, and the ancient alliances underpinning the Empire's unity started to splinter. The first full-fledged war in 400 years had not only begun, it was spreading. When the fighting finally subsided, a chilling silence fell over the Renal expanse. Broken ships and debris floated listlessly, grim testaments to the day's carnage. Lyra stood in the aftermath, surveying the damage from the viewport. She knew this was merely the prologue to something far greater, and far worse. In the dim solitude of his chambers, Kale replayed the final communique before the fleets clashed. Lyra's voice echoed in his mind. Sometimes the cost of peace is fighting for it. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decisions he could no longer undo. Far across the stars, Syndra withdrew to assess her forces, vowing retribution. The war, once unthinkable, was now a reality, and the galaxy would never be the same again.